We have set out as a congregation to read one book of the Bible together from beginning to end. And the book that we have chosen is Ruth, which is a short yet wonderfully surprising book depicting the life and trials of King David's great-grandmother. Now, as we have guests here from the Boy Scout troop and Cub Scout pack that are affiliated with First Christian and who have not been with us along this journey, let me set the stage a little bit from last week. Our homework assignment for the first week was to read through chapter 1 before coming to church. And there we were introduced to a woman from Bethlehem named Naomi. And the quick version of the story is that Naomi had moved to the neighboring country of Moab in order to survive during a famine. She had 2 sons who both got married to Moabite women while they lived in the country of Moab. But Naomi's husband and her 2 sons died shortly after. So 3 widows were left, a mother and her 2 daughters-in-law. In the midst of this, Naomi told the 2 younger women that they should go and return to their families and to start their lives over. She was going to return to Bethlehem to be with her people. And one of these daughters-in-law was Ruth. And Ruth made the commitment to Naomi to leave her homeland and go back with her to Bethlehem and live as if she were Naomi's own child. We did some work together getting behind a lot of the details that this ancient story assumes that we might know as we read through it. Details like this: Israelites had a bitter, even warring relationship with their neighbors, the Moabites. They did not get along. That great King David's own ancestry includes relatives from that other country, which may have raised big questions about his legitimacy as king of Israel. That the writer of this book of Ruth loved to play with words. Like when you understand that Bethlehem literally means house of bread or house of food, the irony that there is no food in Bethlehem is designed to draw us in as we read. But most importantly, the story of Ruth assumes that we know the underlying conditions of life that were faced by women in Naomi and Ruth's situation. Widows were exposed to great dangers of losing everything in a world and a culture where the ability to generate income was overwhelmingly the province of men. In fact, I think that one of the most fascinating aspects of this book that we are reading together is that it just might be a protest against the realities of women's lives when the conditions and expectations are set up the way that they were. I mean, it's like the book is saying to anyone who will listen, y'all, look, here is a story of just how dangerous this kind of life is. And this is what it really looks like and what it is really doing to real people. Well, now we have moved into chapter 2. And again, this is short enough for you to have read it during the morning announcements if you would have liked to, or even skim along with us now. The idea is for us to spend time reading in preparation for worship. As with any story or any book of the Bible, we do most of the work of understanding where it comes from as we begin. And now that we're in the middle of the story, there is less of that work to do, but still there are a few important things that we will need to consider. First, though, just the cliff notes of what we read in chapter 2. In order to survive, Ruth goes to work gathering grain in the fields of Boaz during the harvest. Boaz is a relative of Naomi through her deceased husband. And Boaz sees Ruth in the field and discovers that she is the young woman he's heard about, who basically saved Naomi's life. And he takes her in as one of his own, allowing her to pick some of the choicest grain to sell in the market. And the pivotal scene goes like this. Would anyone like to read what they have already read for the congregation? You don't have to. I'll read it. Excellent. Thank you, Rosie. That will be just fine.
It doesn't really work very well.
I know it doesn't work very. You could probably use that one.
Probably could.
Sounds good.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord? For you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her."
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosie. It is clear you did your homework. Gleaning. In order to understand the story of Ruth, we should be familiar with the idea of gleaning a field during the harvest. This is what Ruth was doing when Boaz encountered her. And we used to do this in college sometimes. There was an organization that would recruit college students to glean apples from local orchards in Virginia. Any apples that were left behind from the pickers were fair game for us. Whatever apples we did not throw at each other, we then would swoop down and take like locusts and collect all that we could. And the apples were distributed to food banks and shelters nearby. I had an inkling back then that this was actually a biblical practice. But we are told that Ruth went into the wheat field that belonged to Boaz so that she could glean behind the reapers. There were actually laws about this. Landowners were forbidden from harvesting their entire crops. Very interesting. Instead, they were supposed to leave the entire edges around their property unharvested, untouched. And in this case, Boaz would have had a ring of standing grain along his property lines. And any part of the harvest that was dropped or accidentally missed were to be left there in the field. And that way, people who did not have their own land to cultivate could come and use the leftovers for their own survival. Ruth was gleaning. Here's how one of those laws reads: when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. We discover in the story that Boaz grants to Ruth much more than this legal right of gleaning. He basically incorporates Ruth into his own family, and in addition to the precarious situations could find themselves in as widows in a man's world, we then encounter this disturbing edge to the story. In fact, we get a glimpse of it here in verse 9. But it is repeated again at the end of chapter 2. While working by herself in the fields, Ruth was somehow at risk of being bothered or harmed by these young men working there with her. The translation we have used here uses the English word bother. Now, the actual word that the author in Hebrew used is pagah. And I don't want the full weight of this word pagah to be lost upon us in English. Because pagah is not just being bothered or harassed, which is bad enough. It implies something much more dangerous. Pagah carries the weight of physical harm, assault, and even rape. And what is acknowledged here in Ruth is that there is a real danger to her or any woman by herself out in the fields among the men. So Boaz says, "Stay in my field, stick with my young women. I have ordered my young men not to pagah you." And with the full weight of what the story is dealing with, I find this to be an interesting intersection for us. In the world presented to us in Ruth, there is a dangerous, shameful, almost permissiveness to the dehumanizing exploitation of women. And perhaps this ancient story is screaming to us that when women are legally and culturally defined as less than, the consequences can look like this. But the ways Boaz reacts within his own culture and in his own time, they can be particularly helpful for any of us in our own culture and time. Because let's face it, things might be different, but the dangerous realities for women at the hands of abusive men are still all too real. I am wading into this discussion with this awareness that someone here, maybe several, that might be drawn into painful experiences and memories. I'm conscious of that. I'm prayerfully hesitant, but also cautiously hopeful to give voice to hope rather than pain to your spirit. Truth. Every 107 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. Truth. A woman's chances of being raped in the U.S. is 1 in 5. Facts. In addition to the physical traumas of assault, survivors are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression. 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol. 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. Reality. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding pagah in our own time and place. Within his time and place, Boaz does something that is very enlightening. Boaz is said to have ordered the young men not to pagah Ruth, not to bother her, as we read in English. What we see is this one man sets the tone among other men in his realm of influence that this behavior is not to be tolerated. Now, I say that, but I also acknowledge that Boaz could have set the tone with his place of prominence in a much bigger way, been a much bigger agent of change. The story only shows how he acted with regards to Ruth, and we will discover more about why he did this as we read in the coming chapters 3 and 4. Still, the fact that one man can set the tone among other men with regards to how women are treated, mistreated, and abused, it cannot be overstated. This is not just a women's issue. It is a man's issue. It is a God issue. There's been this string of ads on TV you may have seen while watching football, showing various NFL players and personalities being silent in the face of domestic violence. Have you seen this? The point being that such prominent cases of abuse towards women that we have witnessed over the last year has exposed the fact that we are not talking effectively about this. My problem with these commercials, even as I love Ice-T, he's one of my guys, my problem is that the commercials just show people largely being silent. As if our sadness and bewilderment is enough to somehow change things. And each ad ends with this sort of plea: help us start the conversation. Well, I have some ideas on that. And since we are hosting some young men aspiring to be true leaders among us here today, this might be especially helpful to you. Do not treat women or girls as anything less than equal partners in life, in any aspect of what you are about. I say that not only as a father, as a brother, or as a son. I say this also as a person of faith who believes that God created all of us, men and women, in the image of what is sacred and holy. And as one who believes that in Christ Jesus there is no longer male or female. You've read this. For we are all one, having been deemed together worthy of grace, love, and forgiveness. Do not add your voice to the culture of permissiveness that looks the other way at making women and girls into objects, rather than fully equal partners in God's creation. Do you know what I mean? When they tell jokes demeaning women, you say, dude, that is not okay. That is not funny. It is not cool. And if you choose, hit them with one of those lamentable statistics if you need to. Because when we make fun of it with our voices, we contribute to the climate that makes it possible. And when your friend talks about a woman or a girl and tells you what he'd like to do to her, because I know that's what we do, don't laugh. Do not play along. Say something. Tell him you are disappointed in him. Tell him you expect more of him. Do not play along. Silence is not acceptable. Silence is, in fact, permission. I promise you, there is no more effective voice in shaping how men and boys behave, how men and boys act, how men and boys feel and think within their souls. There's no more effective voice in any of that than other men.